Got it.
Please welcome Dave Stone with the sign in order form of perfect union.
Thank you, Slim.
I like your shirt, Dave.
Thank you.
Very nice.
First off, I like to be with people. It's kind of interesting when we talk about technology again. All right, there we go. We've all heard this phrase. It's kind of an interesting phrase, and for the longest time, I didn't know what it meant. It's in the preamble to the Constitution. We, the people, and that becomes important. In order to form a more perfect union. That's the phrase that's interesting to me. Some of you who are citizens, new citizens, probably know the Constitution better and know where that came from. Instead of looking at the whole preamble, let's actually put it in context with what was going on in the country at the time. What we had was taxation. We were under British rule. Ruler was on the other side of the ocean. And we were getting taxed. The colonists were getting taxed without having any input as to where those taxes were going or what the taxes were for. So this is where that phrase, taxation without representation, comes from. We don't want to be taxed. There's actually been a movement, taxed enough already, the Tea Party. Those things will repeat themselves throughout history. The other part that we had was the judicial policy. The court system was run by the king. Singular. Taxes governed or run by the king, implemented by Parliament, which was ruled by the king. Single person. From a standpoint of judicial, King George, if he had a problem, the judicial system would be the courts in the colonies were run by the king. The colonists didn't like that. Obviously, if you had a grievance that was legal, you had to get yourself on a ship and go petition to the court in England. So there was a distance problem. There was a control problem. This actually created a lot of tensions, obviously. Third one, the influence of the church, the Anglican Church, the Church of England. You want to take a guess who the ruler of that church was? The leader of that church? The king, again. So the king had control of judicial, taxes, and religion. Put it in context, the colonists fled to America primarily, in some cases, because of religious prosecution. They didn't have the ability of practicing their own religions. James Madison has an interesting quote, and I'm not going to give the whole one. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external or internal controls on the government would be necessary. James Madison actually acknowledged that we are not moral. We'd like to think we are. But we need some control. We need oversight. We need to have checks and balances. So it's an interesting quote. What that triggered was the next portion, because at the same time, there was something called the Enlightenment, which was occurring prior to the Revolution. It was about individual rights. It was about liberty. But there were two influential leaders at the time, philosophers, who historically, in some cases had already passed, but this is where the founding fathers based the Constitution and the structure of the government on. John Locke, I highly recommend, if anyone is interested, read John Locke's Second Treatise of Government. Also, Montesquieu. Those were the two influential leaders at the time that helped us to shape this country. But going back to that phrase, in order to form a more perfect union. What the heck, a more perfect union? Turns out, we did the Declaration of Independence. We told Brits, see ya, we're out of here. We want to govern ourselves. We had the Revolutionary War. Shortly following that, we had what was called the Articles of Confederation. This was actually the first attempt at a constitution. Had some pros and cons. It was significant because it was the start. It was the framework of it. But you know what? Rev 1 of the Constitution had some issues. It was nice from a framework perspective. It's helped to put the framework of the governance in place. So still some rough edges. But it had a lack of federal power. There wasn't a centralized government. Still a confederation of 13 individual colonies. So you didn't have that consolidation. You couldn't raise taxes. We had just come out of the French Indian War. We were in the American Revolution. So we had to get funds to pay for all those. Also, commerce was an issue. There was no regulation of commerce between the states. So individual states could control only what's in their state. But what we realize, and this is where the second Constitutional Convention comes in, this is where the Constitution comes from. They realized that there were inadequacies in the Articles of Confederation. Had the call for a Constitutional Convention, and they established a structure. Interestingly enough, Rhode Island didn't want to participate. So they didn't want to participate because of some of the attendees in the Second Constitutional Convention. By the way, I'm going to touch all three of the things we should never talk about at work: race, religion, politics. So let's see what I can do about that. The initial makeup of Congress and the House of Representatives. Do this in summary. Congress was representing the states portion. 2 representatives from every state. So every state had an equal voice. Then you had the House of Representatives, which was based upon the population. So here's where the people's voice came in. If you notice, the states, the Congress, those people were appointed by each of the states. The representatives were elected by the people in the states. And if you extend this out, the president is elected through the Electoral College. The reason that it was structured this way was to make sure that there was no political power that had sole control of the government. Back to the dilemma with King George. So, the Great Compromise. This was the Great Compromise, was to split the Congress and House of Representatives, so there were 2 houses. The next one was called the 3/5 Compromise. This is where the race comes in. In figuring out how the representatives were built in House of Representatives, they counted the enslaved people as 3/5 of a citizenship. Interesting debates that go on. If you ever want to take a look at it, read the minutes of the Second Constitutional Convention. Very heated debate. Southern states wanted those enslaved individuals to be counted as full individuals because that gave them more voice in the House of Representatives. The northern states said, not going to do it. So the reason for that was they don't have a voice in the manner of voting, so you can't get more representatives because of that. So this is where the race portion comes in. Interesting comment. You'll hear activists, and I grew up hearing about it, was the founding fathers hated enslaved individuals, hated black people, because they only said they were only 3/5 of a person. This is where that comes from. It wasn't racist. It was actually to help establish an end to slavery. Now, let's get to the next one. First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise before. The Establishment Clause and the Exercise Clause. This is the only thing in the Constitution that actually talks about religion. I'm sure we've all heard about separation of church and state. And you'll hear people say that is in the Constitution. It's not. That's the only reference in the Constitution. Where separation of church and state comes from is letters from Thomas Jefferson to the Denbury Baptists And they were concerned that the government was going to prevent their free exercise of religion. That's where the phrase separation of church and state comes from. So it's kind of an interesting background about how people have shifted and how they framed it. All right, small chart, small graphic. This is the timeline, and we'll make the slides available. This is the timeline. Declaration of Independence, 1776. Articles of Confederation, 1777. Constitution, Rev 2, 1788, 89. Ratification and everything. So you start seeing this timeline. Remember, now this is the politics side. Remember how we said the House of Representatives was voted on by the people? That's how those representatives were. And Congress was appointed by the states. So you had that separation of the houses of Congress. 17th Amendment was passed in 1911. And what it did was to establish the, it actually got rid of Congress being voted on, or Congress being appointed by the states, and made it a popular vote. The driver at the time was the Populist Party. They wanted to push for more people representation. You want to take a guess what else the Populist Party influenced? Marxism. Populist movement was an influence to Marxism. So what happened was the state's voice got minimized, and it became more of the people's voice. So with that, we have touched on race, religion, politics, as it relates to how the Constitution was developed. And with that, thank you, fellow Toastmasters. Thank you, sir.